Cameras weren't rolling when it happened. No headlines, no crowds, just a 17-year-old boy in an oversized jumpsuit, standing in court while a judge sentenced him to life without parole for a crime he didn't commit. No real evidence, no defense, no one speaking up, except for one moment, one phone call. A name no one expected to be on the other end, the U.S. Attorney General. But why would a man with that much power be the only one who could save the boy no one listened to? And what happens when the system that silenced him is the same one his own father helped build? This is the story of Malik Turner, and this time, the person they tried to erase is the one holding the pen. The courtroom wasn't silent out of respect. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy in your chest, the kind that tells you something irreversible is about to happen, and no one's going to stop it. Malik Turner stood next to the public defender, hands cuffed, orange jumpsuit loose on his thin frame. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken much since the arrest, and now it seemed no one was willing to speak for him either. His mother, Denise, sat in the back row, holding her breath with hands clenched so tightly they turned pale. She hadn't slept in days, not since the knock on the door, not since the police took her son without explanation. She called everyone she could think of. Friends, church members, lawyers. Most didn't answer. The rest said it was too late, too expensive, too complicated. The judge, Wallace Grant, barely glanced up. He flipped through a folder, muttered something under his breath, and then spoke the words that would change Malik's life forever. Life without parole. No emotion, no pause, just another name on another docket. The lawyer, court-appointed, overworked, underprepared, offered no objection, no closing argument, no plea for leniency. Malik didn't even look surprised. He just looked down, like he'd expected this ending long before the rest of the room caught up. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even close. But it was finished. For the people watching, especially the older ones, the scene felt hauntingly familiar. Robert, a retired bus driver sitting quietly in the back, whispered to the man beside him, "I've seen this before. Different kid, same outcome." The system hadn't asked who Malik was. It hadn't looked at his school records or his artwork. It didn't ask where he was that night or why he was carrying pencils instead of cash. All it saw was a hoodie, a time, a skin color, and it moved forward, fast and final. As the guard stepped forward to take Malik away, Denise collapsed into herself, crying without sound. The judge closed the file and reached for the next one. And just like that, it was done. But something had shifted. A phone call was coming. And the boy no one listened to was about to speak to someone with power to hear, because this time the one they dismissed was the only person who could unravel the silence they had built. Before the cell bars, before the headlines, Malik was a boy who saw the world in lines and shadows, in faces caught mid-thought, in corners of streets most people walked past. While other kids played ball or scrolled their phones, Malik sketched. His notebooks were filled with eyes. Watchful, quiet eyes. He scanned his drawings at the public library after school, filing them into folders labeled Portfolio 1, Portfolio 2, and Hope. That was the title of his third folder. Hope. He wasn't a loner, but he was often alone. It wasn't sadness, it was focus. He sat at the back of the library, headphones in, studying anatomy guides and practicing proportions. He wanted to attend an art school in Chicago. He'd already filled out the first part of the scholarship form. That paper was still in his backpack the night he was taken. To those who knew him, his art teacher, the elderly librarian who let him stay past closing, even the security guard who teased him gently for being the last to leave. Malik was gentle. He never raised his voice, never got into fights. He didn't steal. He didn't even curse. He walked slow, thought before he spoke. And when he did speak, it was usually to ask a question about light or movement or texture. But none of that was written in the case file. The court didn't see the sketches. The judge didn't hear the praise from teachers. His lawyer didn't mention the scholarship application or the dozens of afternoons spent in a quiet corner of the library basement. Those pieces of Malik's life were invisible the moment he put on a jumpsuit. For older viewers who raised kids or grandkids like Malik, bright, quiet, sensitive, this part hurts in a different way. They've seen how the world forgets soft voices, how it labels stillness as suspicious, how dreams on paper are treated like nothing when fear walks into the room. Mary, a 74-year-old grandmother from Ohio, once told her church group, "My grandson draws the same way. I worry every day they'll see his silence as defiance." The tragedy wasn't just that Malik was mistaken. It's that no one bothered to know who he was before they judged who he must be. The folder labeled Hope was never opened in court. The page with the scholarship essay was never read. And the drawing he left on the scanner tray that evening, an unfinished portrait of a boy looking out a window, was discarded as evidence. But that boy was watching. And that window was never closed. It was a Thursday evening, late fall. The kind of chill that makes you zip your jacket all the way up and walk a little faster, even if you're not in a rush. Malik had just left the library. His scanner time had run out, but he stayed long enough to finish a quick sketch. A boy sitting on a fire escape, looking at a dog below. He zipped up his hoodie, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and headed toward the bus stop. He never made it. A patrol car pulled up beside him at the corner of Rose and 5th. 2 officers stepped out fast. No greeting, no explanation. One of them yelled for him to stop. Malik turned, confused, then reached for his ID. That was when they rushed him. Thrown to the ground, knees in his back, elbows scraped against concrete, his sketchbook crushed under a boot. They said he matched the description: black male, late teens, wearing a dark hoodie. Nothing else. They didn't ask where he'd been. They didn't look inside his bag, just emptied it, let the pencils scatter, ignored the library slip with the 7:10 p.m. timestamp. They didn't ask for witnesses, even though the security guard at the library entrance had seen him leave just minutes earlier. The arrest report later said he was non-compliant, that he resisted. But Malik hadn't spoken a word. He was too stunned to even process what was happening. His mother got the call at 10:47 p.m. No details, just a name and a charge. She asked if he was okay. The voice on the other end didn't answer. For people who grew up in neighborhoods where sirens were part of the soundscape, this part of the story isn't unfamiliar. Walter, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran, remembers his first stop and frisk at age 15. Once they decide who you are, he says, they stop looking at what's in your hands and start looking for what they expect to find. That's what happened to Malik. They didn't find stolen goods. No weapon. No cash. But they did find a glove covered in graphite dust, the kind artists use for shading. They photographed it like it was a clue, entered it into evidence, wrote it down like it mattered. His alibi? Never checked. The library footage? Erased during routine maintenance 2 days later. The only thing preserved from that night was the arrest photo, his eyes swollen, his mouth slightly open, as if still trying to ask, "Why me?" And in a folder back at the precinct, someone scribbled, "Case cleared" in red ink. What no one saw was that same backpack, now sealed in evidence, still held a sealed envelope. Inside was his application for the Chicago School of Visual Arts. The essay read, "I want to show the world what we forget to see." But now the world had already looked away. 3 weeks later, Malik was brought into court. He didn't know what to expect, but part of him still believed someone would finally stop and ask what really happened. That maybe the judge would look up and notice the name of the high school on his file. That maybe someone, anyone, would ask where he was that night. But no one did. Judge Wallace Grant had 18 cases on the docket that morning. Malik's was number 7. The prosecutor summarized the charges in under 3 minutes. Robbery, minor injury to store clerk, suspect apprehended near the scene, glove found in possession. No surveillance footage was shown, no eyewitnesses testified, there were no fingerprints, no stolen items recovered. Just a printed photo of a blurry figure in a hoodie and a glove that still smelled faintly of charcoal. Malik's lawyer barely spoke. He shuffled papers, stumbled over a few phrases, and didn't challenge any of the state's statements. He never mentioned the library, never asked for the security footage, never questioned the timeline. When asked if the defense had anything to add, he simply said, "No, Your Honor." The entire hearing lasted 13 minutes. When Judge Grant leaned into the microphone and said, "Life without parole," it didn't even sound like a decision. It sounded like punctuation. Malik blinked once. Denise, his mother, gasped. But no one turned toward her. The bailiff stepped forward, already moving to escort Malik out. There were no objections, no delays, no appeals filed. For many older viewers, especially those who remember courtrooms from years past, this felt like betrayal. Not just of one boy, but of the idea that due process was still something real. Carol, a 72-year-old retired court clerk from St. Louis, said quietly after watching the footage, "We used to pause, even for the guilty. Now, we don't even breathe for the innocent." The judge didn't explain the sentence. He didn't have to. The law allowed it. The docket moved on. Outside, Malik's name wasn't on any newspaper. Inside, his name was already printed on a prison intake form. And in the hallway, Denise stood against the wall for nearly 10 minutes. Not crying, not speaking, just staring at the closed courtroom doors. Like she was still waiting for someone to come out and say there had been a mistake. But no one came, and no one looked back. The juvenile facility was cold, not in temperature but in tone. The walls were pale. The lights stayed on through the night. The sounds came in bursts, keys, doors, short commands. Malik didn't say much those first days. He followed instructions, kept to himself. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. But late one evening, a guard came to his cell and said he had 5 minutes on the phone. He stared at the receiver for a long time. The numbers he knew were few. His mother's phone had been disconnected earlier that day. His aunt wouldn't answer. She'd already said this was too much to take on. His friend Michael didn't have a working phone, so he dialed the number he hadn't used in 5 years. Raymond Ellis picked up on the second ring. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a quiet breath. "It's me," Malik said. A longer pause. The voice on the other end stiffened. "Malik? I didn't do it." That was all he said. Not a plea, not a breakdown, just 5 words. Raymond didn't speak for several seconds. He was in his office, stacks of legal briefs in front of him, half a coffee on the desk. As U.S. Attorney General, his schedule was constant. His authority stretched across the country. His voice had been behind a dozen high-profile prosecutions. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because the voice on the phone wasn't just any teenager. It was his son. A boy he hadn't seen since the divorce. A boy he'd convinced himself was better off without him. He had signed the child support checks. He had sent birthday cards most years. But he hadn't called, hadn't visited, hadn't known Malik's face had changed, or that he'd been drawing every day for the past 4 years. And now, that voice, older, deeper, but unmistakably his, had reached out through concrete walls to say, "I didn't do it." For many watching, especially fathers who had been distant, the call lands differently. Samuel, 69, who hadn't spoken to his son in over a decade, said after hearing the story, "There's a sound in a child's voice when they stop believing someone will save them." That call? That was a last try. Raymond didn't promise anything that night. He didn't know what to believe yet. But as he hung up, his hands trembled, and the next morning, before sunrise, he cleared his calendar. Because no matter how long it had been, no matter what lines had been crossed or left uncrossed, when your son calls from a cage and you have the power to open doors, you don't ask if he deserves it, you ask what happened. And then you start digging. Raymond didn't start with suspicion. He started with protocol. He requested the arrest report, then the evidence log, then the court transcript. Nothing about it looked out of place until it did. The report was vague, the timestamps were inconsistent. The evidence list included a glove, but omitted the sketchbook. There was no mention of the library. The court transcript showed no cross-examination. The sentencing? Rushed, compressed into less than a page. He read the documents twice, then again. It didn't add up, so he pulled the arresting officer's body cam footage. The file was labeled, but when he opened it, the video froze after 6 seconds. The audio was garbled. He called an old colleague at Internal Affairs, who confirmed what Raymond suspected but didn't want to hear. "That's not a malfunction. That's someone cleaning house." Raymond didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study surrounded by stacks of case files from the same judge, Wallace Grant. Over the past 5 years, nearly 80% of Judge Grant's juvenile convictions had gone to one facility, Midlands Correctional Youth Center, a private center, and the name listed under its board of directors? Brian Grant, his nephew. Malik wasn't the first. He was part of a pattern. Raymond formed a small task force, quietly, unofficially, a retired data analyst, a civil rights lawyer from Baltimore, a young DOJ intern with a background in digital forensics. They called themselves the 7 o'clock crew. because that's when they met, before sunrise, before phones rang, before questions came. Within weeks, they uncovered missing evidence logs, repeated phrasing across dozens of arrest reports, and minor defendants whose public defenders had all been assigned from the same rotation. Lawyers known for short pleas and fast agreements. Raymond stared at a wall covered in red pins and printouts. It looked less like a legal review and more like a map of controlled damage. This wasn't just neglect, he muttered one morning. This was orchestration. For viewers who once worked in government, or those who still believe in the chain of accountability, this is the moment where belief gets tested. Karen, 75, a retired court clerk from Pennsylvania, reflected, "It's not that we didn't know the system could be broken. It's that we thought someone would catch it before it collapsed on a child." Raymond knew he had to tread carefully. A public misstep could bury everything. So he stayed quiet, dug deeper, kept a file labeled Malik in a locked drawer next to one labeled Wallace Grant. But something inside him had already shifted. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about debt. A father's debt to a son he hadn't protected. A man of the law facing what the law had become, and what he was willing to risk to fix it. Claire Morano had worked in Judge Wallace Grant's courtroom for nearly 12 years. She was the person who printed the files, labeled the motions, and stamped the sentencing orders. She knew the schedule before the judge walked in. She could tell which cases would be over in minutes and which ones would drag past lunch. She didn't ask questions. That was the job. But something had been bothering her for a while. It wasn't one thing, it was everything. Case numbers disappearing from the digital log. Motions filed but never entered. Evidence envelopes marked received with no initials. At first she thought it was clerical error. Then she saw Malik Turner's file. It had been closed unusually fast. The trial record was thin. The defense section was blank. Claire remembered that day. She remembered the boy's mother crying in the back. She remembered how quickly the judge moved on to the next case. And she remembered the sealed envelope labeled "for transfer" that was never scanned into the system. It was sent directly to Midlands Correctional Youth Center. That name kept showing up. Claire looked closer. Over the next few nights, she copied what she could. Quietly, old sentencing memos, calendar shifts, private correspondence between the judge and facility administrators. There were patterns, dates moved to avoid certain reporters, cases clustered before funding deadlines, and a handwritten note that read, "Fast-track Turner, BC wants him in by 15th. BC. Brian Grant." She couldn't ignore it anymore. One morning before court began, she walked into the file room, closed the door, and dialed a number from an article she'd saved. A DOJ email tip line connected to civil rights oversight. She didn't leave her name, but she left details, dates, names, case IDs. 2 days later, she received a private message on her personal email. It was from a burner address, just one line. "Are you willing to testify?" She didn't reply right away. She sat with the question, thought about her pension, her routine, her silence. Then she remembered Malik, just a kid, never even spoke in court. Claire typed 3 words, "if I must." For many older Americans, those who work behind desks, in offices where the wrong question could mean the end of a career, Claire's choice strikes a nerve. Howard, 77, who spent decades in a city planning department, put it simply, sometimes doing the right thing means you go home scared. Every day. Claire copied the files onto a flash drive, labeled it receipts, and dropped it in an envelope addressed to a private P.O. box linked to Raymond Ellis's task force. She didn't sign her name. She didn't have to. Inside were records no one was supposed to see. Proof that Malik wasn't an accident. He was a delivery. And Judge Wallace Grant had made it happen, quietly, efficiently, and for years. Inside the walls of Midlands Correctional Youth Center, Malik didn't speak much, but his hands kept moving. The guards called it a coping mechanism. The counselors called it distraction. But for Malik, it was the only way to stay whole. He drew on anything he could find, scrap paper, the backs of intake forms, even napkins from the cafeteria. He started with faces. One boy had eyes that stayed wide open even while he slept. Another clenched his jaw so tightly it left marks on his gums. Malik sketched them with quiet respect, never as prisoners, never as criminals, just as boys, tired, waiting, forgotten. When he finished a portrait, he gave it away. He told the others to send them home, if they still had people who would open the mail. Most didn't, so the drawings stayed folded in lockers and taped to bunks, quiet reminders that someone had seen them as human. One day, a volunteer teacher snapped a photo of a drawing, a portrait of a boy named Antoine who had just turned 15 behind bars. She posted it online with a short caption, "He drew this last night. He's never taken a class." It was shared 17 times that day, then 300 the next. By the end of the week, it was trending under a hashtag that hadn't existed before, #InsideVoices. People began asking, who's the artist? How did a child this young end up here? Why haven't we heard of him before? They heard now. Journalists traced the artwork back to Malik. Former teachers recognized the style. A Chicago art nonprofit started uploading his sketches anonymously. Each image came with a short caption, the subject's age, the charge, and how many months they'd been inside without trial. Malik's drawings weren't protests. They weren't angry. They didn't shout. But they couldn't be ignored, because every line carried weight. Every eye looked back at the viewer with a question too heavy to answer. For older viewers, especially those who lived through the civil rights movement or remember when protest songs played on kitchen radios, this wasn't new, but it was different. Mildred, 73, said it best. Back then, we marched. Now, they draw. Same fight, different tools. Inside Voices became more than a hashtag. It became a call. For justice, for awareness. For one boy the world had thrown away, who refused to disappear. And as the images spread, so did the pressure. On the court, on the judge, on the system. And that pressure was about to reach a courtroom that for the first time in years would be forced to pause and finally listen. It didn't look like a revolution. Just another morning at the federal district court. Polished floors, metal detectors, rows of worn benches. But for those who had followed Malik's story, the teachers who had spoken out, the strangers who had shared his drawings, the families who had lost sons to silence, it was more than a hearing. It was a reckoning. Raymond Ellis sat at the front with a small legal team behind him. Not political aides, not image consultants. Civil rights attorneys, a public defender from D.C., a retired judge who had come out of retirement just to stand beside him. They weren't here to argue loopholes. They were here to show what had been hidden and who had chosen not to see. The courtroom was full, but quiet, not from formality, from expectation. Then Malik entered. No handcuffs, no jumpsuit, just a dark suit that didn't quite fit and shoes that creaked when he walked. He didn't speak. He just sat beside his attorney, eyes forward, as if he'd practiced for this moment in silence. Raymond stood. He didn't open with emotion. He opened with documents, photos of shredded reports, scans of emails from Judge Wallace Grant to Midlands Correctional, charts of conviction timelines and payment schedules. Then came the flash drive. Claire Moreno's files, scanned, cataloged, authenticated, and finally her testimony, delivered through a remote audio feed. Her voice was steady. Low, almost too soft for the room, but every word landed like a hammer. He was never supposed to walk out. That's what she said. Across the room, reporters scribbled furiously. Spectators held their breath. Even the judge, a woman known for her discipline and control, paused for a long moment before allowing the defense to respond. But they didn't respond. They asked for time. They didn't get it. Because the courtroom had already shifted. Malik's sketches were entered as exhibits, not as art, but as record. Each drawing now carried a case number, a name, a date. And by the time the hearing closed, the court had what it needed, a conviction built on collapsed evidence, a judge compromised by conflict of interest, a child discarded because no one thought anyone would care. But someone had. One voice had called, another had answered, and now the silence was broken. For the older viewers, the veterans of courtrooms, of protests, of long-fought battles for dignity, this was the moment they had waited for. Not noise, not chaos, just a room full of truth, spoken clearly and finally heard. No shouting, no slogans, just justice, slow but sure, stepping forward. And when Malik stood to leave, he didn't look triumphant. He looked relieved, like a weight had shifted, not off his shoulders but back where it belonged. The ruling came on a Thursday. There were no crowds outside, no cameras flashing, just a clerk stepping into the hallway with a file in her hand and a single line spoken into a quiet room. The conviction has been vacated. Malik didn't react at first. He blinked. then slowly turned toward his attorney, who nodded once, softly, like confirming something fragile. Denise, his mother, covered her face and wept into both hands. Raymond stood still. For the first time since that phone call, he didn't need to say anything. The law had spoken for him. Malik walked out of the building into a sky that looked no different than it had months ago. But the air felt different. He didn't rush. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't wave. He just walked, step by step, like learning his own pace again. Back home, his bedroom was just as he had left it. Books stacked on the floor, a box of pencils on the desk, a folder labeled Portfolio 3, Hope, that someone had tucked away in a drawer. He opened it that night. Some of the pages were bent, one was torn, but the drawings were still there. They had waited. He taped a blank sheet of paper to the wall. That was all he did. No declarations, no sketches, just the page, white, quiet, ready. It wasn't an ending, it wasn't a comeback, it was a beginning. For viewers in their 60s and 70s, this image is the one that stays. Because they've lived through eras where change came not with a roar, but with a breath. Not with a banner, but with a step taken forward when no one else dared to move. Helen, 76, who watched the final segment alone in her kitchen, later wrote, "That blank page, that's everything we ever hoped for our children, that they'd get the chance to decide what comes next." Malik was nearly erased, but now the world sees him, not as a defendant, not as a hashtag, but as an artist, as a young man, as a voice that drew truth into the light, and he's just getting started. This story reminds us that justice is not always loud, and neither is truth. For many of us who have lived long enough to see patterns repeat, Malik's experience is a painful reflection of what happens when systems forget the humanity of the people inside them. It teaches us that silence, especially from those in power, can be as harmful as an outright lie. But it also shows something else: the power of one voice, one decision, one moment of courage. Whether it's a father choosing to listen, a clerk choosing to speak, or a young man choosing to draw instead of give up, these acts matter. They ripple. And for those of us who've ever felt dismissed or watched someone be erased without reason, Malik's journey reminds us that quiet dignity is not weakness. It's strength with purpose. We don't need titles to stand for what's right. We just need the willingness to pay attention to the small details, the forgotten faces, the voices no one else hears. Because sometimes change doesn't begin in courtrooms or protests. It begins in living rooms, dinner tables, and morning walks, when we choose to believe, not in systems, but in people, and choose to act when it matters most. Malik never raised his voice. Not in court, not in anger, not even when they took everything from him, but through every sketch, every page, every look he gave without speaking. He was asking a question: will anyone see me for who I am, not what they assume I must be? The truth is, there are thousands of Malik Turners, past and present. Some are still inside, some never made it out, and the system that nearly erased him, it's not broken by accident, it's been quiet by design. But today, it wasn't a protest or a headline that made the difference. It was a phone call, a file clerk, a pencil, and a boy who refused to let silence be his final word. Because real change doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it enters the room gently, carrying a sketchbook and leaving behind a blank page. A page waiting for what comes next, written not by power, but by truth. Type 1 if you've ever seen someone silenced when they needed help the most. Type 2 if you believe justice can still begin with one quiet, steady voice. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. We tell stories that reveal not just what happened, but why it still matters.